President.
American pandemic, Republican. American workers, American workers. Republican workers.
President, Republican, American workers, workers, American workers, Republican, American, Republican president.
President, Republican, American president, workers, American workers, president, American president, Republican president, that president,
Republican
president, Republican,
president, American president, Republican, American president, American president,
American pandemic, Republican. American workers, Republican.
American workers, American workers, Republican workers at risk, Republican, Republican president.
Republican, American president, workers, American workers, president.
American workers, president, workers, president,
Workers, American president, American.
President. American pandemic, Republican. American workers, Republican workers.
President.
American workers, American workers, Republican, American president.
Republican, successful, workers, American workers, president, American
Republican
President, American president,
workers,
President, American president.
And I was workers, American workers, president.
American,
president, I,
American
American workers,
American pandemic, Republican. American workers, American workers. Republican workers.
American workers, American workers, Republican workers, Republican, American, Republican president.
Republican.